What impact do you think this may have on the Russian side, their actions on the battlefield?
I think that there's two things to understand here. Firstly, there's the military plans, which I think have been laid out for some time. I don't think they're going to change their plans, but I think they're going to say to themselves, well, these plans now can be executed more effectively and more quickly because the Ukrainians are going to get even weaker faster than we expected. So we've got no reason to change our plans. We're going to push on towards the river, towards the Dnieper. We're going to push on in Pokrovsk and all of these places. So I think the Russians have a sense, I think they've had it for some time, but even more now, the sense that the military tide is running in their direction. But I'm going to say something else, and this is going to perhaps surprise some people. I think the Russians are also going to say to themselves this: well, the United States is now running into the limits of what it can do. So it's going to start to change policy over Ukraine. This is our chance, therefore, to establish a dialogue with the United States, not just about Ukraine, but about all sorts of other matters that are important to us and to our relationship with the Americans. Because the Russians, as I always say, are incredibly tough-minded and very realistic people. They understand absolutely that the United States is there to stay, that it is still a great power, a mighty power, and that it therefore is important to try to move beyond this issue of Ukraine and to see whether some kind of normalization of relations with the United States is possible. So I think that I would not be surprised if over the next couple of weeks we see a renewed push from the Russians to achieve that, and telling the Americans, look, you tried to come up against us in Ukraine, it failed. You now see that we can push back when we have to. So take us seriously now, and let's move forward and sort out our various problems with each other.
I wonder if you could touch on something here that I had the privilege of getting to hear you talk about when we had dinner in London last week, for the benefit of our viewers here. And that is something you mentioned on the different mentality of thinking on the two sides, the Western side and on the Russian side. You made a comment that they think deeper and longer term, whereas we're only thinking shorter term. And I wonder if you can explain a little bit of just, first of all, just how the two sides view things, and then how that's going to impact on how we reach some kind of negotiated end to this. Or if there ever will be, because the alternative is that we keep thinking short term and putting our blinders on, that we don't want to see that logistics stuff, for example, that with the constraints, and we just keep going with the fiction, and then until Russia finally ends up just outright winning a military victory, and then you don't have to worry about negotiations. But how does all that play in? I wonder if you could explain.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to think tactics. We look for the big win now. The Russians don't. They think strategy. They are almost, and it's a historical thing. If you read their literature, you see they're very, very clearly. They tend to look at the longer, deeper forces. They look beyond the immediate term. They say to themselves, well, we're going to win this battle, but does this battle help us to win the war? And if we do win the war, what comes after? So they don't like to be put in a position where they are improvising from one day to the next. That isn't their style. They're more methodical, and they tend to think, as I said, in a more long-term way, and in some ways a more how to put it, a less passionate way than we do. They don't let themselves get angry about things in the way that we do. You can see that very much in the way that they talk about things. So they will be saying to themselves today, the Americans are pulling out of Ukraine in one form or another, or so it seems. We can take advantage of that on the battlefield. But our long-term objective must continue to be a good, at least if not a good relationship with the Americans, at least a relationship with the Americans based on a certain degree of mutual respect, so that we can move things together in a way that enhances our own long-term security. And I think that is going to be the kind of discussions that they will be having in Moscow over the next couple of hours, not days. I mean, there will be a meeting probably going on in the Kremlin where they're going to be talking very soon about the implications of this.
Well, that's fascinating. And so does that also imply that even though we're thinking tactically and just, whatever's going to happen in the next 24 hours, that whereas the Russians are thinking at the end of the strategic outcome that they're seeking, that they would be willing to say, all right, y'all can have your fits and starts here, whatever, but we're going to go on. And specifically, do you think that the Russian people would be, I guess, amenable or accepting if it takes another year or even 2 years to reach their security objectives? Would they continue to support the government?
Yeah, I mean, I was recently in Russia, as you know, and I was actually surprised at finding both how confident and generally satisfied, I think, people were with the situation. I expected to hear many more
include the pace of operations.
Absolutely, including the pace of operations. It isn't something that seems to exercise people in Russia in the kind of way that many of the people who say they support Russia, they get very worked up about it. They say, why isn't Russia moving faster? In Russia itself, they seem to have a kind of innate understanding that this is how it's done and that it makes better sense to proceed that way. When I said that the Russians do strategy, whereas we in the West do tactics, it's not just a question of that isn't just true of Putin and Belousov and Gerasimov and those sort of people. We're talking about a general attitude that is very, very prevalent in Russian society, that work in a way so that time works for you. And if it means approaching the war in this kind of way, then it's not meeting much criticism in Russia. It meets more understanding than anything else. There's a sense that this is working to... Yeah.
Is that what we see at play? I can say from my own perspective that I was surprised at the seeming laxity of response, both of the Russian people and of the Russian leaders, i.e. Putin, going back to the Crocus terrorist attack that happened, whatever it was, a year and a half ago, something like that, in Moscow. If that had happened in the United States, you'd have had a situation kind of like 9/11, like, in Washington, D.C., something like this happens. Somebody's going to get bombed in about 24 hours. I mean, that like after 9/11, we were saying it was bin Laden. We somehow figured that out hours after the thing happened. And within a week, we're in Afghanistan, a week. But then the Russians have taken a kind of a slower pace with this. There have been 2 assassinations in Moscow of high-ranking Russian generals. And you didn't see an outcry among the people. You didn't see an outcry among the leaders. It was actually very quiet. And I was thinking, man, if that had happened in the U.S., like if the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or somebody else had been assassinated outside of his apartment in Washington, our hair would be on fire. The public would be demanding somebody retribution, within days or so. How does that, is that what you're talking about with how the Russian people?
It's exactly what I was talking about. I was in Russia, as it happens, in Moscow, in fact, at the time of the Beslan siege. This is what happened in the early 2000s when that school was captured by jihadi terrorists, and it was a terrible business. And I remember being astonished at the discipline, and I think this is the right word, actually, not so much calm, but very disciplined way in which the Russian population responded to all of that. And there were rumors of bomb attacks on the metro. And in fact, I seem to remember that roughly at that time, there was a bomb attack on the metro in Moscow, and it was back running within hours. I mean, things which inconceivable in London if such a thing were to happen. And yes, obviously, it was the big topic of conversation, and everybody was determined, at that time to see it through, and there was no question of Russia compromising or anything of that kind. But there wasn't that kind of pressure that you would see in Britain as well, by the way, as in the United States, to respond immediately and savagely, and to and to do something that would be hasty and out of control. There was a sense, on the contrary, that what you need to do is pull together, consolidate, work it out, and see it through. It's the mentality is more about seeing it through than hitting back immediately.
That's fair. That is a big difference in the approach between the two sides, and I think will have implications for how this war ends up playing out. In the last few minutes that we have here, I want to take a look at the inner workings of the European Union or / NATO, and is there a solid, unified vision between what Starmer was saying there a minute ago after the NATO summit, where, by the way, we also came out and said, Mark Rutte specifically said, by the way, we still believe what we said in the Washington summit last year, that it's inevitable that Ukraine will be in NATO. The very worst, irreversible that they're going to be in NATO, which absolutely makes no sense to me whatsoever. That why you would be saying the one thing, it's like waving a red cape in front of a bull for Russia, because that was what they have cited as one of their primary reasons why they launched the invasion in February 2022. To be saying that now here, and at the same time you're trying to say you're trying to get to an end. Well, in the inner workings of Europe, especially, you see pushing towards this new sanction package. You have one of the somebody who would lose because of that in the European Union, which is Slovakia, and their president Robert Fico was kind of aggravated about it.
Vysokých cien energií. Pripravme sa na to, že ak dôjde k realizácii ideologicky škodlivého návrhu Európskej komisie od 1. januára 2028 zastaví toky plynu na Slovensko, že dôjde k razantnému navyšovaniu cien energií. Preto možnosť využívať európske fondy aj na kompenzácie, pokiaľ ide o domácnosti, pokiaľ ide o priemysel, je pre nás absolútne vítaná. Keby to nebol problém, tak Slovensko nie je výslovne vymenované ako jediná krajina v záveroch Európskej rady, ktorá skončila vo štvrtok, kde je napísané o Slovensku ako o krajine, ktorá má s týmto obrovský problém. Všetci vedia, že sme krajina, ktorá dnes je na konci rúry a nie na začiatku rúry. Čiže nám to spôsobí obrovské ťažkosti. Pýtam sa, prečo pre Boha Slovensko má platiť vysoké ceny kvôli Ukrajine? Kvôli Ukrajine, nie kvôli ukrajinským občanom. Kvôli ukrajinskej politike, aby som to povedal veľmi.
So if people weren't able to read the subtitles on the bottom there, if you were on a phone or something, bottom line is Robert Fico is really angry that the European Commission wants to put into a policy that's going to shut off the gas coming in from Russia, which is going to directly impact his country and have dramatically higher gas prices, which many in the European Union already suffer because they have cut off from that. And he makes that comment at the end. He said, why should we suffer for Ukraine people? And then he says, no, not the Ukraine people, the Ukraine politicians. What do you make of that?
Well, he's absolutely right. And I mean, I wish there were more politicians in Europe like him. I wish we had some politicians like him in the British Parliament, if I have to say, because he's being realistic about the whole situation, both in Europe and in Ukraine. And he is showing some genuine concern about the long-term effects of all of this on Slovak people and Slovak society, which he is ultimately responsible for. Now, to implement even more sanctions, we discussed earlier how these sanctions have never achieved any of the objectives that were set, how Ian Proud, our mutual friend, has pointed this out. Impose even more sanctions that are going to be bad for you, for Slovakia, for the European Union, for Britain, for all of these countries, in support of what is now a definitely losing cause, seems completely irrational. And he is right. The frustrating thing is that it's so far leaders of these countries in Central and Eastern Europe, Hungary, Slovakia, the president of Croatia, some political figures in Bulgaria, apparently an increasing number of people in the Czech Republic, that it's left to people like that in Europe to argue this case, and that the leaders of the big powers, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Britain, are closing their eyes and ears to it. Gradually, I think the ground is shifting. You can certainly see that in Germany, to some extent in Italy and France too. But it is glacially slow. And unfortunately, it's not really reached us in Britain.
But do you think that, so if I could just say, the Slovak reaction there, and you could certainly put Viktor Orban in the same category from Hungary, he's talking about, this is the benefit of our country. This is the cost to our country, pointlessly, because the war can't be won anyway. So there's no, why should I suffer for something that can't succeed? I mean, like physically suffer. And do you think that now then that the U.S. has announced the cutting off of the supplies because of America first, i.e., we're looking out for what's good for our country, which is the same thing that Robert Fico's doing, the same thing that some of these others you just mentioned are doing. Do you think that might make the ice of that glacier melt a little faster?
Yeah, I think it will. I think inevitably it will. I mean, you'll see vehement denials. You see the German government wanting to sanction Nord Stream pipelines because the Americans want to invest in them. I mean, all sorts of stupid things like that. But in time, eventually, reason will, the logic of the situation will break through, and the shift will come. But of course, there's an enormous amount of damage being done to the fabric of European society and Europe's economy in the meantime. And it's fabric, it's damage that's going to be very, very difficult to repair. We're not the dynamic society that, to some extent, to a great extent, you still are in the United States with all your enormous resources. We are a much more fragmented continent than the United States is. So the United States can adjust over time to these sort of things. We're going to find it very difficult to. And the longer we delay bringing peace to our own continent and reestablishing the trade links and the economic contacts and stabilizing the situation, the more difficult doing that is going to be.
And let me ask you on that factor, that I guess the last question we'll ask here. You had at this NATO summit, probably the biggest takeaway was that everybody said we are all agree that by 2035, we're all going to be at 5% of GDP spending on NATO and military capacity in various different categories. But you also look at the economic health of the European Union at large, and you see anemic growth. In fact, you in some places you see negative growth. Do they have the capacity, and will they keep making sacrifices like that, each country, for an outcome that, by the way, simultaneous to all this, you have Vladimir Putin, who came out also last week and said, y'all are crazy if you think that we're coming for you. I'm planning on cutting defense spending after we accomplish our objectives in this SMO. So I don't know what's up with that. That would seem to put more pressure on other countries to follow the Robert Fico version.
Well, I think eventually it will, because this is completely unachievable. I mean, European economies are saddled with debt. Virtually every single one of them has a budgetary crisis. Europe is deindustrializing rapidly. And again, this is underestimated in the United States. I was reading recently a report about how many factories have closed in Britain since the start of this year. I mean, it's the pace of factory closure in Britain is accelerating.
Really?
And the idea that we can somehow turn things round and, become, a military industrial power again is just by 2035 is ridiculous. And by the way, the Russians made another point about this with a twinkle in their eye, by the way, because it wasn't just Putin, it was another official. He said it doesn't really make a great deal of sense, because you say that Russia is about to attack you and gobble you up any day, from one day to the next, in a year's time or in 2 or 3 years' time. So if that's true, why are you waiting until 2035
Right.
before you increase your GDP to 5%? The maths, as you put it, doesn't really make much sense.
Man, and you just wonder how much longer this weird fiction is just going to continue to permeate policies that have real negative impact on the people within Europe. And we'll see what happens, because we just don't know. I mean, right now we can merely speculate, but I mean, there could be some pretty dramatic effects in the medium term on the physical conduct of the war, because we're cutting off some of these supplies. Because I don't think anybody in Europe is going to pony up to Secretary Rubio's comments in May about, others in Europe have some of these, but I bet they're not going to be signing up too quick to back up the loss of the U.S. support there. So we'll see how that's going to end up going.
Indeed, absolutely. I mean, we can't do it. I mean, everybody knows it. People pretend otherwise, but that is the reality that everybody needs to start to admit and accept.
They certainly do, and we're going to have to leave it right there. We have some other questions coming up, but we're just running up against the time clock here. But it's always an absolute pleasure and delight to have you on today, Alexander. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you. We're delighted to come and look forward to doing so again.
Look forward to that very soon as well. And thank you guys very much. But we also have another good show coming up this afternoon. You're not going to want to miss. Andrei Martyanov is going to be coming on. He's going to be talking about the Russia and Iran realignment in the works, and how has it been that a lot of people are saying, hey, Russia kind of left Iran high and dry because of their alliance, and that shows how Russia's weakness. But we're going to look with Andrei. Is that really what it showed? And was that the nature? Was there a relationship, an actual military alliance as akin to Article 5 of the NATO treaty, or was it something different? But in any case, there are probably some significant implications for Russia in what's happening in the Middle East. We'll talk about that at 3 p.m. this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive. See you then.